Why, hello there, my internet friends. My name is John Jagsney, and I'm very excited to be sharing with you some fun video game cinematic recreation things. A little bit about myself, and I'll just show you my reel as I go through the spiel. I am a big nerd that loves using Cinema 4D, After Effects, Unreal Engine, all the fun tools to make awesome video content. My primary client is a company called UltraPro. They make a lot of accessories to the tabletop industry, such as Dungeons and Dragons, Magic the Gathering, etc. And I do almost all of their video content. I also do freelance outside of that other freelance contract. I am a freelancer, but I have had the opportunity to find this niche of board games, tabletop, hobby, entertainment experiences that I love. And with that, me being a gamer, that really leads into what I like to make. So today I'm going to be going over my trailer recreation of the Mass Effect 2 Project Lazarus. If you've played that game, you'll know that Commander Shepard unfortunately passes in a tragic attack from an unknown enemy and is reincarnated by the company Cerberus. While they are technically an enemy in Mass Effect 1, in Mass Effect 2 they become a major player and they resurrect Commander Shepard. So that's what this trailer is. It is recreating that experience. Now, I did this using Cinema 4D, Unreal Engine, Redshift, After Effects, Embergen. There were a lot of things that went into this, and I know that I am very happy with the result. Matthias Omatola and I had about a month and a half to work on this project. We wanted to get this trailer out for N7 Day. So with that said, now that you've seen a little bit of it as I've voiced over some of our thoughts, why don't we dive into the project file and I can show you what we're going to be going over. So one of the things I will say is that when we were discussing the things to talk about in this, we knew that the project was broken up into 11 different scenes. That's just the way I work. However the original artist did it, I have no idea. So with that in mind, we have broken the project down in a way that makes sense. There is my thumbnail from the last time I opened up the project. It is now up on YouTube when you are watching this on my YouTube channel, but as I said, we're going to be diving into the scenes in this. So the first scene that we're going to be going over is Scene 4. And Scene 4 is really cool. I am very excited with how it turned out because it was really using a lot of different techniques between using Cinema and Unreal Engine and Embergen. So I'm going to give this a quick playback in the viewport so we can see what's up. It's actually a very, very simple composition job. What I mean by that is when we observe this project file, there's not a lot of layers of AOVs or render passes or anything like that. The benefits about working with Cinema 4D and Unreal Engine is you can operate with the principle of get it right in camera. With my background using a DSLR, shooting events, I very much like being able to do as much in camera as I can, and that principle is going to carry over to doing things in render. So basically, the workflow is we start in Cinema 4D, do a lot of the blockout animation, build a lot of the environment as much as we can without doing any texturing. It's like, does this get the feel across? And then we bring that into Unreal. So when we play it back, we can see that there's a lot of extra detail in the scene, but overall, we did it all in camera. And you might say, well, that might be a risk because what if you have to re-render? But the benefits about using Unreal is that we can render in almost real time. It is not fully real time because we're adding more particles, some VDBs, etc. So why don't we open up the Cinema file now and we can see what that looks like. Alright, so with Cinema 4D open, we have the scene here, and if you look at what we did in the trailer versus what we have in Cinema, obviously very different. In Cinema, we did none of the texturing, none of the lighting. What we do in Cinema is to get all of the dynamics and animation done so that when we bring it into Unreal and Embergen, we have the foundation of our geometry to work around and build a lot of the creative around that. So let's give this a playback in our Cinema 4D viewport and see what's happening. So we can see that we have a camera, static camera, and then we have some dynamics of our red blood cells going off into the distance. Now, there's a couple of techniques that we're doing here to execute this. The first off is these red blood cells. Obviously, when you have dynamics in Cinema 4D, the dynamic simulation starts when the playhead is going in your timeline or on your animation frames. So we are triggering the red blood cells in a very fun, interesting way. One of the things that I love to do. And that is to have the dynamics trigger based off of ghost colliders. So what is happening? What do I mean by that? Well, the first thing is that if you look in my object manager up here, I have this sphere with this tag called a ghost, and I have it turned off in our sphere or in our for our render view or viewport view, because if we were to play it back, we're just going to see this sphere just fly right through the scene right there. And what that's doing is that's triggering all of the dynamics to activate. So I'm going to show you how to do that. Before I go into that, what I want to do is just give you a quick rundown of how I did the dynamics in this scene. Now I'm using the bullet dynamics in this tag, and I'm keeping the gravity extremely low. If you look at the original trailer, the red blood cells are in some sort of fluid, so we have a very low amount of gravity, so it's as if they are suspended in water or blood or plasma or whatever. Now, for my expert settings, my collision margin is very, very small, because this is assuming we're inside a vein or some sort of medical scenario. It's a very, very small scale. So the scale of our dynamics is set to 0.025, and then our collision margin is much, much higher. If I were to crank this up to the default values, just by right-clicking and reset the default, and then play this back, it's just not going to cooperate the way we want it to. They're kind of just flying a lot more. Now, why don't we just undo that, and I'll show you how we created the dynamics of the red blood cells. So I'm going to hit Control-N to open up a new project really quick, and I'm going to take this red blood cell right here, copy it, drop it into my scene. I'm going to zero out all my coordinates so that we see this red blood cell. Now I'm going to clone it, so I'm going to hold Alt on my keyboard and click on my cloner object, and that's going to create clones of it. Because the red blood cell is so small, it's kind of just spreading them out, but we'll just set it to 5, 5, 5. Now we have some red blood cells in the scene. So first off, we need to make this a dynamic object. Right now, because I copied the object over, it already has the dynamics tag. So that's useful. And if we were to play this back, they should theoretically just fall down. Why are you not falling down? Burp. We're just going to delete that and right click and bullet tags, rigid body. And then there we go. Now they just disappear. They're going all over the place. So I'm going to turn off the gravity, hit Control-D on my project, go to the bullet, and set gravity to like 1. So that if we play this back, they're going to very slowly fall. Now, I don't want them to start doing their dynamics until something triggers them. So the benefit about this workflow is that we can go to the dynamics tag and we can set the trigger from immediately to on collision. So now if I play this back, nothing's going to happen. But if I make an object, let's say just a cube for now, and I scale it down to fit the world scale, I just move it over here, right click on the cube, bullet, and collider body. So now if I play this back, nothing happens, but if I move the cube around, hey look, hits the red blood cells, they start flying all over the place. But what I don't want to happen is I do not want the red blood cells to interact with the cube. So very conveniently, we can set this collider object into a different type of collider. So instead, we'll right-click, bullet, and ghost body. So now, if we play this back, nothing happens, but then if I move the cube through, all those red blood cells are going to activate. And you know what? I will turn up the gravity just to better demonstrate this to like maybe 100, and then move my cube over, play this back, and there they go. So that's how we animated the red blood cells. I'm lazy, and I could have done that by hand, but instead, I'd rather do that just letting the computer think about it for me. Now, obviously, the scale of your scene will really depend on the animation that you are going to get. So we definitely went through a handful of passes, and this is a tutorial project file that I did. This is not the actual live file because I wanted to do some other tweaks to make it a little bit cleaner for tutorial purposes. So the dynamics aren't exactly from what we had originally, but it gets the point across. So we can see that those red blood cells sort of start animating. And the reason why we did it this way is in the original trailer, it has some timing that I wanted to sync up with the fluid coming out. Speaking of the fluid, when we see this little syringe here, and then we look at the original shot, there's definitely some sort of fluid being injected from this medical device. Now, obviously, there's no fluid right here. So what did we do there with this fluid? This is where the tool Embergen came in. So Embergen is a real-time particle effects fire smoke simulator. Obviously, we're not dealing with fire and smoke. We're dealing with liquid, but sometimes you kind of just have to go and work with what you have. I tried comping it in After Effects, and it didn't look good. And the reason why is that this geometry of this tube was very important to me that the fluid sort of interact with this geometry of the tube here. So what we had to do with this is instead we had to export some version of this geometry without any of the red blood cells, because otherwise it was just going to get way too hairy in the Embergen software. So I'll open that up right now. Open project files, presentation files for scene to Embergen. And this is effectively the same exact scene, but we really simplified down the geometry. So now it's just the syringe sort of going in, and that's all. So the benefit about this is that it allows us to bring this into other software because it's a lot simpler. So that is a perfect time to open up Embergen. Now, from here, we can navigate to the project folder and go to my project files, presentation files, and hey, look, there's my stuff. So Embergen, I'm going to open it up on my other monitor really quick. And the first thing that you see when you open up Embergen is going to be a donut that's on fire. Now, sure, awesome, cool. This makes sense. It looks very much like a standard node editor, and what's cool about it is you can increase the scale of the noise, you can add forces, you can change the shape of the primitives, but I wanted this to interact with my original scene. So let's open up that file so we can not save that. We will navigate to that file, scene 04, project files, Embergen, and I will say we were just doing some tests, and it turns out that the tests worked, so should be this file. Yes. Now, it doesn't look like much right now, but hey, there is our scene file, and if we go through our if we let the scene load just a little bit more, we can see that we have the geometry in our scene. And what's really cool about that is I was able to then keyframe the VDB data to interact with the scene. So if I hit Control R and then play that back, we can see the syringe is going to come down right here, and then it's going to trigger the scene. We can see that it has some sort of fall off as it gets closer to the geometry of the tube, and that's exactly what I wanted. Now, what's cool about this is from here we can go into our emitter settings and our simulation settings and create wind, or we can create sort of forces to interact with our scene. So for example, in the simulation node, we have our wind direction, and I can just crank up this value, like let's say -20. And then if we play this back, it's going to go way off into the distance. It's going down. We don't want that. We're just going to undo that. Let's say 5. And now it's going to fly backwards. One big downside between working with Cinema and Embergen and Unreal is their world axes are all different, so it does take a little bit of getting used to. And this is not going to be a full breakdown of Embergen. This is purely the workflow of how we got from Cinema to Embergen to Unreal, etc. So I'm going to keep this section short, and from here, after we build and import our geometry, have this collide with our VDB, we create some different forces. So if we play this back, we can change the scale of our noise and just play it back. Just a quick demonstration after we fuss with all the settings and we get exactly what we want. Obviously, this is not what we want right now. I'm just going to set the wind back to what, 0.2? Much better to me. We can go to our volume tab and we can see we have a node out right here called VDB, and we export the VDB and then we can bring that into Unreal. Now, I will say Unreal Engine is not does not have VDBs built in natively. There is a plugin that you will have to get, and I will recommend a tutorial from a Mr. Jonathan Winbush. He's been on the 3D Motion Show before, and he has a easy how to install VDBs into Unreal. We could have theoretically done it with Redshift, but because we had such a short time and I didn't want to composite the scene too much and deal with longer render times, I chose not to do the Redshift option, but I could have theoretically done that. I choose this way just because I want to get everything as much as I can in camera. Speaking of getting things in camera, now is a perfect time to start talking about Unreal. So after I do my Cinema work, after I do my Embergen work, I can start bringing things to Unreal and make it look pretty. So we'll close this. We're not going to save it. And we are just going to crack open the Unreal file. So I'm going to go to my Epic Launcher and go to Library, find my project, and I'm actually going to demonstrate the live project because I did have a presentation one, but I decided, you know what, this is going to look better if I show you the actual thing. So I'm going to let this open up. Sometimes Unreal does take a quick second to open. And now we are in Unreal Engine, and we can see that the scene is looking pretty sweet as is. So with that in mind, let's just give this a quick playback and you can see what we are working with before we start rebuilding a little bit of this in Unreal real time. Looks pretty cool. That's the shot. And from there, we would render it out. But why don't we demonstrate how to do this? So we're going to go to our content browser. And typically when you start an Unreal project, it would look pretty empty. I have been working in this project file for about a month. It is as organized as I can be. So we're going to go to right-click on our content browser, add a new level, and call this Scene 04 Presentation. We'll dive in there. Now, here's the thing when it comes to working with Cinema 4D and Unreal Engine. There's a plugin that you need, and that's called the Datasmith plugin. So if you've not worked with Unreal before, you'll go up to your settings, go into your plugins, and then if you search C4D, very conveniently, there's a Datasmith C4D importer. This is the most important thing that you need to bring over any animation that you're bringing from Cinema into Unreal. So once that's done, you'll have to restart Unreal, and then we can go up to our little cube plus sign up here, and we'll see an import assets, file import datasmith. And super conveniently, we can bring our Cinema 4D project file from C4D into Unreal. So I'm going to navigate to that project file, but before I click that, I'm going to jump over to Cinema 4D really quick and share a few things. So I'm back in that file, and here we are. We have the scene. We have the animation that we're going to bring over. And the big thing that I do need to communicate is that UV maps are very important when it comes to bringing things into Unreal for a variety of reasons. So the one thing I do recommend is if you do any cheaty, hacky ways to create your models in Cinema, I highly recommend taking some time to revisit your UVs to make things look good. So if I, for example, look at this subdivision surface, which is the big tube, and I shift click on my UV tag over here, we can see that right now it's just a cube. It's actually not UV'd. So what we would want to do is go into our UV edit tab here and find some way to UV this. Now, when I navigate over to that tab, we can see that there's a bunch of different options, packed, cubic, angle, etc. And effectively what we're trying to do is get something that makes sense when it comes to our UVs. So depending on how dense your geometry is, this might take a while. So be very conscious of that. So the way I did this tube here is I used automatic UV and packed. This took a long time, so I'm not going to do it live. Instead, what I'm going to do is open up my scene for vein, and I actually have a scene for UV'd version of it. And here we can see that here's that subdivision surface, and it's effectively the same thing, but if we go to our paint textures, and for some reason this geometry up here just got moved, we're just going to move that back into place. It technically does belong there, and I don't know why it moved over there. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to open up the FBX that I did export, and we can see here that the subdivision surface UV is perfectly set up in this cube. And if I go to my textures UV map, we can see that it has some nicer looking distribution of the UV map. And the reason why we do this is Unreal likes it. So we're going to take this subdivision surface and copy it into our scene, and then we'll delete the original. And now we're just going to save that. And once it saves, we can start bringing things into Unreal. So that's saved. Last thing I should mention, I did forget to say one thing. Control D to go to your project settings and make sure that you go to your Cineware tab and enable everything. That is very important for bringing things into Unreal. So from there, we can double click on that. And in fact, actually, I'm going to save a copy of this project file because I know that scene 4.4 was the one I was working with in Unreal for the live project. We're making a new one, 4.5. Now we can import this and plop this into our content folder. Now I'm blowing through this a little fast, but the benefit of this is that I can show you more of the process. So you don't really have to change anything once you start importing things from Cinema into Unreal. So once you get your Cinema file done and it's saved for Cineware, you can then bring it into Unreal pretty easily. So from here, it's going to make a folder in our content folder, and I know I have a lot of folders here, but we can see 4_5. And if we double click on the animations tab, and then we click on this little clapboard here, it's going to create an animation sequence. Now, it's very dark right now. So one of the cool things, we can go to our window and environment light mixer and just click on all of this once. And what that's going to do is create a sort of fake environment for us to work with. So we have our scene, we have our geometry, but there's some weird stuff happening. Now, the reason why it looks a little weird is that in Cinema, we're doing some cheats and hacks to make this work. So I'm going to go back to my standard tab and leave my camera. We can see here that we have this long cylinder, and that is actually what's cloning our red blood cells along the length of our scene. So in Unreal, we can delete that because it's baking all of the position data of the clones into Unreal. So there's a couple things we need to clean up. First, this collider cylinder that I have, we can see in our object manager over here. Just get rid of that. Don't need that. Next, if we hold right click and then use the WASD, it's very much like a video game. Click on this sphere. This is the sphere that I showed you earlier that was creating the animation for the colliders. We don't need that anymore because it baked down all the animation from Cinema into Unreal. So just delete the sphere. Don't need that. Now, I will say that the animation does not obey the in and out of your Cinema file, so you will have to change your start time and end time. So we'll just go to our sequencer, and it's very much like a NLE, nonlinear editor, like Adobe Premiere, but we have keyframes of stuff here. Now, the last thing that you do have to do when you bring something from Cinema into Unreal is turn off lock to display at runtime. And I have a tutorial on my YouTube channel that goes into why. It creates some weird motion blur things. And then we have to add a camera cut track. So from here, we can, with this camera cut track, find our main camera. And if we bring the playhead to the very beginning of our endpoint, and then we click on this little camera button here, we can see that we're looking through the camera where we need to. Now I have this other cylinder here I'm just going to delete. It does not look right still. And the reason why is because this subdivision surface, it doesn't have a material on it. So this is the benefit about working with Unreal. Once you have everything from Cinema brought over into Unreal, you can just start adding the fun, beautiful details. So I know here that I have this Scene 4 vein material, and I created this in Substance Painter. I can just drag this on here, and it's going to add my material onto the scene. Now the camera, the depth of field is not where we want it to be, so we can just find our depth of field right there. And then we can crank up the aperture so that we have a much deeper. Still really dark though, so what we can do is we can start adding lights, and we'll just zero out the position, and hey look, there's a light in the scene now, and we can start seeing our environment working. This is why I love the workflow from Cinema into Unreal. I will say this every single time. I love the animation tools of Cinema with MoGraph and the dynamics and the fields and colliders. It gives me a lot of control to work with a lot of the tools in Cinema. And then I can do the beautiful look development in Unreal. I can add some fog. I can go to my density. I can add some volumetric, and then just really crank up that density to, like, say 1, and now we're going to get that really cool looking atmospheric look, and it's all going to render in real time. I can move these lights around. Obviously we're getting blown out a lot, so we can just find a nice spot for this right, let's say right there, and then bring up the source radius so that we're not getting terribly harsh shadows. Bring down the light to, say, 0.1. And now we're starting to get somewhere. Now with these red blood cells, it's the same thing. We'd be able to select all of our geometry. And this is one downside about Unreal. When you're dealing with a lot of different geometry and you have to replace all their materials, you kind of just have to go in and do all of the selection of things. But once everything is selected, then you can go to your materials. I'm going to go to this red blood cell that I created, display my materials, drop on, And display materials, drop that on, and basically this is where we would go when it came to creating the scene. We'd spend a lot of time just creating the look in Unreal so that we can get to the final destination of the cinematic. Now, what I want to do is I'm going to actually navigate to the scene that I have finished and built. So we will jump over to scene 04. Save. Just make sure you save early and save often. And we are going to jump into the original file that I brought from Cinema into Unreal. Go to that clapboard, and the last thing I'm going to show you is that VDB. So the plugin is, you do need a separate plugin for bringing in VDBs, but after that, once we bring our everything and we create our look in Cinema, we can then, create our look in Unreal, we can then drop in our final little details, and the VDB is very much just like drag and drop into the scene and add it in there. So, like I said earlier, trying to get everything done in camera. So the VDB is a part of that. I didn't want to have to comp anything in After Effects because I wanted the VDB and the animation of the fluid going in to obey the geometry. And then I also wanted the particles to be in camera as well. We're not going to talk about Niagara today, which is Unreal's particle system, and depending on the look, sometimes I'll end up using Trapcode Particular, other times I'll use Niagara. I'm really just trying to do as much as I can in camera. So that is scene 04 of the Mass Effect 2 Project Lazarus trailer recreation. Let's jump to the next scene. So our next scene we're talking about is scene 4.5. It's a little insert shot of this medical device that is being injecting Commander Shepard with some sort of rejuvenation, revival fluid. I don't know what it is. It's medical stuff. It's fancy science. So what this scene is, it's a very simple push-in shot and creating this effect of stuff moving into from this injector into the scene. And if you look at the original trailer, it's a quick little shot to just, hey, create some context to this fluid that's being injected into Commander Shepard. So why don't we leave our main camera? We can see what the scene is. Now, the benefit about working with this overall workflow is that we can do a lot of our main scene building in either Cinema or Unreal. Now, because there's a lot of geometry that I wanted to be able to control, I wanted to do this part in Cinema. Now, if we leave our camera, I'm going to share some movie magic. When we leave the camera, none of it makes sense. Let's be real. A lot of the time, sometimes you don't need to worry about what the camera doesn't see because no one's going to know. No one's going to know. So this medical device is not attached to anything. And if I had more time and truly more skills with modeling, I would have built this entire scene from scratch. Now, instead, we did not do that. Instead, we found these models on TurboSquid. There's going to be links on my YouTube channel where you can find the list of assets that we found. There was this sci-fi lab from TurboSquid that we brought in. Now, we're not going to bring this into Unreal because I already showed you that workflow, but I'm going to show you a couple other pro tips that you should be aware of when bringing things from Cinema into other software. The first is making sure you get some sort of foundation for your materials. None of these materials are going to be final. What you are trying to do is effectively create a system to fully understand what materials you're adding to your scene. So what I mean by that is, okay, I have this orange door or this ceiling light or these screens, and all this is, it's a sort of template so that when we bring something from Cinema into our target software being Unreal, we can easily replace it. So my point behind sharing this is that the workflow it really is trying to look ahead. Where are you going to save time now versus later? Because I know I'm not doing any of my lighting in cinema. This is definitely going to be a situation where I just need to get the foundation, the building blocks there. Now, the big thing that you do have to be conscious of when you are bringing stuff into other software is that Cinema needs to bake everything down before you bring it over into Unreal. So for this version, we kept everything pretty basic, but what I would do before I would actually start bringing this stuff into our final destination is I would go to my target, let's say this arm base right here, and I would drag all of this into my timeline, and then I would go to functions, bake objects, and then I would uncheck create copy and check all parameters and then click OK. So then when you do that and then you go to your object and delete the IK tag because you don't want that, you're going to see the animation of all the little arms. And it's a very subtle movement, but this workflow is very, very important when you're bringing things into Unreal. So this overall scene in Cinema looks pretty gross, but once you bring it over into After Effects or into Unreal, then After Effects, it will look that much better once you can dial in your lighting and whatnot. So Cinema is my multi-tool for all the animation things because it is just so much easier to use the curve editor here than it is over on the other side of Unreal. And the reason why is in Unreal, you can't create folders or anything like that in the sequencer, so it can get very hairy when you're animating a lot of objects. Fortunately, with Cinema, you can break things down into only the things that you are looking at and drag things in and out of your F-curve or your dope sheet. That's the word. So that is this scene. It's a very simple camera push in with some things moving on in the background. Not a whole lot really from a cinematic standpoint, but from a technical standpoint of all this modeling and geometry that we didn't have to do. We did get templates, but there would be a lot that would have to go into that. Now, I want to show you one more scene from this project that I'm actually really excited about. It is a much more intense comp job that I would normally do. So why don't we dive into the final scene for this presentation? So the final scene we're talking about is scene 09, the one where the heart is finally beating and whatnot. I will say I did not animate the heart. That is another thing that we did find online from TurboSquid, but we did model and create everything else around the scene. So if we play it back in our Cinema 4D viewport here, what we can see is the tech object scanning the heart, and we see the heart beating. Now, the thing I was actually most excited about is while I am not a modeler, there's a big thing that I do need to share when it comes to working with just 3D in general, and that is topology. Topology being the way in which your edge flow and your geometry just looks. It is a very technical thing, and modelers do appreciate good topology, and there are a lot of hacky ways to get around it in any 3D tool, but when you do it that way, you become more limited on certain things. So what do I mean by that? Well, if we leave our camera here, what we can see is that if we scrub through our dope sheet, there's this bool object creating this shape out of the this HUD element in our scene. And if I turn off this disk, we can see here that there's very clearly a hole in it. And the reason why this is happening is in the original trailer, and I'll pull up After Effects so we can see what's happening. It is sort of showing a FUI version of the heart, and then it animates on in this little HUD element the flesh material of the heart. So when I look at this hierarchy of this HUD element, it's a lot of bools, and bools can sometimes be a way in which your geometry will cut out a hole. But if you look very, very closely, this looks gross and weird. And what I mean by that, for those who don't necessarily know topology, you generally want quads being a shape with 4 sides, and we can see here that there's definitely some triangles there. And when it comes to having good topology, you want a pretty general uniform size between all of your quads, and we can see here that the triangles here are all like weird random shapes. Now, okay, Jags, you're talking about topology and you want good topology, but why are you doing it this way? One, time, how much time we had and how much time we spent actually R&Ding this, which was a lot. There was a handful of sleepless nights in there trying to figure out how to execute this. And on the surface, a lot of other artists recommended to me spline masks. What is a spline mask? Well, a spline mask is effectively taking a spline or the shape of some object and effectively trying to cut out the shape relative to your object. So what does that mean? Well, hear me out. Here's the version of it that we did with a spline mask. And if you look at the original reference, you can see that the shape that's cut out also it obeys the scale up and down of the animated element. So I have this similar effect here, and it does what we're trying to do, but if you look very, very closely at the geometry right here, it has this weird, awkward shading, and when you move around, you're losing the circular sort of shape of it because it's trying to interpolate all of that geometry in there. So obviously this would not work because it breaks the shape entirely. And this is using spline mask, where we have, if we turn off our spline wrap, this is the original shape of our spline. And then what we're doing is we're creating a mask with this big circle and little circle to create that opening in our shape. And then we're deforming it with a spline wrap, so it's effectively wrapping around in a circle. Okay, that makes sense, but it still didn't work out because we didn't have good topology. Cinema 4D didn't know how to create that effect in those weird areas. And that's not just universal to Cinema 4D. I did try this in other software as well, such as Blender, and it was giving me a similar issue. So topology was the solution there. So if we open up a version of the HUD element right here, we can see that we effectively have the same thing. And if we scale up these 3 objects, and I obviously could have spent more time creating a more clean way to do this with espresso or expressions or whatever, but we didn't because I crunched on time. But hey, it works and it creates a little shape. Granted, it is a little bit more 3D than the reference, but it works because we're looking at it from a specific angle. And then with this, we can simply turn on our spline wrap. And when we look around our object, it holds a much more circular shape. So the way this was executed is we brought this original spline from Adobe Illustrator into Cinema, and then we actually geometry modeled it using the poly pen to create good edge flow on our object. Let's talk about the render settings in Cinema before we dive into After Effects really quick. So I use the take system in Cinema because it allowed me to render out different parts of my scene more conveniently. So if I have After Effects open and we jump over to my output scene 09, and we go to the heart, we have different passes: heart full, heart flesh, and then the disc. And if I go to Cinema and we go to our Redshift render view and we dock this over on the side, let's close After Effects really quick so that we don't burn the computer. And back in Cinema, we'll close our dope sheet, and with the heart full, we can see, if we play this, we can see that we have the heart with the little shape in the center, and we have the animation. And the material is very, very simple. Actually, it's a Redshift material with a Fresnel. And if you don't know what a Fresnel is, it's basically changing the way the light hits it based on the angle to the camera. So as it gets, as the angle changes from being more perpendicular to more parallel, there's probably a more scientific way to explain it. You can see that it gets brighter on the edges here. That's effectively what the Fresnel is doing, and I have this piped in to the overall emission and opacity. If I were to just add a regular Redshift material and just drop this on, replace the HUD element, we can see that it's just going to... Is it that one? There we go. We can see that it's just, hey, look, it's a gray material, but the Fresnel adds a lot more detail. So the first take and the first pass from this scene was the heart, and then we have the heart flesh. And the heart flesh is actually just the heart by itself. And it's a very simple lighting setup. We're just using a single HDRI, because sometimes you don't need to add a ton of lights to make things look decent. And then with that, we also have the disc. And the disc is actually very much just a puzzle mat. And the disc is very much just a puzzle mat. So right now on this frame, we don't see the disc because it's set to scale 0, 0, 0, 0. But if we scrub through, we can see that the disc scales up. Now, for the actual render settings for the first two passes, we did render out an AOV if we wanted to, but I ended up just using the beauty passes and rendering with an alpha channel. But then for the disc, that's where we did get a little bit more complex. So with the disc render settings here, if we jump over to our advanced render settings, AOV, show AOV manager, we have a puzzle mat, and the ID of this disc is set to 1. So then when we look at our render settings, it's going to give us a perfectly white mat for our heart to reveal itself. So that is what we did for this compositing job. And then if we just save this, Control S, close all of that, and we jump into After Effects, we can see here, while I didn't name my layers very, very well, we can see that the crypto mat or the exports gave us the exact tags that we need. And from here, if we solo off this layer, we can see that it's going to give us the heart full layer that we had from Redshift. Then we can turn on the heart flesh, and then the disc, which is this crypto mat right here. If I just turn that on, we can see that, oh, actually not that one, it should be this one. We can see that this crypto mat right here is giving us the mat for our heart flesh. So we just turn that off, and hey, look, that makes sense. Now, if you've not updated to the newest version of After Effects, we have the wonderful new track mat tools that allow us to pick whip our track mats to everything that we need. So once we finish up that those render settings, it's very, very simple as far as what else is here. It's just a lot of layering of little objects. Now, for those of you who are new, and it does sound like very privilege for me to say this is super simple, but when you think about it, just really think about just the individual components of this shot, it does make sense, or it should make sense. Because we have those planes that were just flying off in random space, and we have those objects. If we hit U on this plane, very much like in cinema, we had those planes flying. We have keyframe data of these planes. And if I just solo all of these planes and I turn on my transparency grid, we can see here that those planes are very much moving in the same way they were moving in cinema. And then all we do is we pick whip the little panels of data, hackery type data, where it's just a pre-comp of these other little elements into the scene, and we just cake it on and layer it on. And the cool part about this is it allowed me to just kind of be creative and flexible, obviously following the source material, but just like, hey, we need more detail. Let's add a layer of that. And then for the background, it's a basic animation from Unreal of that lab environment. And if we just solo it with our Aces effect and we turn off our effects, it's very simply just a mannequin. Actually, it's the Cinema 4D standard mannequin that's laying on that table with a little cloth sim blanket and some animated arms. And overall, that is pretty much the project file. When it came to creating this, it really was a lot of brute force. It was a lot of learning some new techniques such as Embergen and getting good UVs to get it to translate into Unreal nicely, and then just putting your head down, doing the work, and sometimes honestly ignoring proceduralism, because sometimes you just have to go. You have to make it happen. And the last thing I want to share for my presentation here is this book I'm reading. It's called A Rebel Without a Crew. And it is a book by Robert Rodriguez, the director. He's worked on El Mariachi, Spy Kids, Book of Boba Fett. And one of the biggest themes from that book is if you have a dream, you have this aspiration for art, and you know in your heart that you just have to go and make it, sometimes you just have to go and make it, and there is no right way to do it. And I know that this trailer is not perfect. There are definitely things I wish I could have spent more time on with our time constraints, but I'm still incredibly happy with it because it was more about the process and the journey rather than the end result. So I know I've been talking a lot, and I appreciate you watching this. And with that in mind, I will finally play the trailer and let you enjoy it.
Commander Shepard has been recovered. The Lazarus Project will proceed as planned.